Welcome to our event today. Thank you all for coming. My name is David LESHER. I am the Government Affairs Director at PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California. And I'm sure most or all of you are aware of PPIC, but we are a nonpartisan think tank, research institute. We do work on most of the issues that cross the plate here in Sacramento, as well as a statewide survey and many other things. We are located in San Francisco as our headquarters. We have offices here in Sacramento where I work with some others, and as well as Ryken, our presenter today. A couple of quick announcements before we get started, and then we'll have a presentation and then a Q&A after that. One is thank you to the James Irvine Foundation. The lunch and this briefing is part of a series of policy briefings we're doing at lunch on a variety of different topics, and it's funded by, we call it the James Irvine Foundation Briefing Series. Also, a couple of upcoming events that I think are going to be, they're very interesting. I wanted to make an announcement about it. On September 11th at the Sheraton Hotel here in Sacramento, we are hosting a discussion with the two candidates for Secretary of State, Senator Alex Padilla and Republican Pete Peterson. So it'll be a discussion over lunch hour at the Sheraton Hotel. Also in October, on October 6th, also at the Sheraton, we're hosting a forum for the two new leaders of the legislature, Assembly Speaker Tony Atkins and Senator Kevin De Leon, the president-elect for the Senate President Pro Tem-elect in the Senate. They will both be talking with PPIC President Mark Baldessari at the Sheraton on October 6th. A couple of other announcements. On your chair, you should have seen a copy of the report and a little form that is a kind of evaluation of this event. And if you wanted to fill it out and drop it off on your way out at the table in the back and tell us how you think we did, that would be very much appreciated. Also, let's see, this is being taped for broadcast, so if you want to avoid an embarrassing moment, you might silence your cell phones. And you can find this report and this presentation and these slides all online at our website, ppic.org. So with that, let me introduce our speaker, and we'll get to our presentation today. Ryken Grattet is a policy fellow at PPIC, a research fellow at PPIC, and he works from Sacramento and has done an extensive amount of work on corrections and public safety and realignment in California at PPIC and previously even at CDCR. So please welcome Ryken Grattet.
Thank you. Thank you, David. I want to start with a few acknowledgments. First of all, my collaborator on this project is Mia Bird. She's sitting over on the right there. She'll come up after the presentation and help me field questions during the Q&A. Also want to acknowledge Brandon Martin and Daniel Krim, who are research associates at PPIC, who provided a lot of research support for this project. But probably the biggest debt actually for this work actually goes to our colleagues at CDCR who have provided us with data, not just for this project over the years, and deserve some credit for it, although not responsibility for anything we say, I should say. But they've been a great collaborator with us, and we really appreciate their support. Okay, so this is actually, for people who are paying close attention to PPIC and its activities, the second installment in a series of projects that PPIC will do on recidivism. And you might ask yourself, why recidivism? Why is recidivism such a central focus? And really, I would say it's kind of a key measure of correctional, how a correctional system is performing. It's not the only measure, but it's a pretty important measure. And by the measure of recidivism, the California correctional system prior to realignment was not performing particularly well. So today I'm going to focus on, kind of continue this focus on, that we started earlier in the summer on realignment and recidivism. And I'm going to also offer a glimpse into whether the choices that counties make in terms of strategic approach can actually have effects with offenders and changing their recidivism patterns. Okay, let's start with a little bit of background on recidivism. or on realignment. As many of you know, realignment is really quite a enormous transformation for the state of California in terms of its correctional system. But in particular, realignment really had sort of three different kinds of implications. First of all, offenders who used to go to state prison, offenders who used to come out of state prison to go on to state parole now go to county probation offenders. This is a particular segment of the people who are released from state prison. It's going to be the one I'm going to focus on quite a bit here today. But second, it also kept offenders who previously were eligible for terms in state prison in county correctional systems. And then offenders who violate their conditions of community supervision now can only be revoked to county jails rather than returned to the state prison system. And so these are really kind of the principal dimensions of realignment. Realignment was justified as a means of reducing the state's prison population and saving the state money, but it was also premised on the idea that counties could achieve better results with offenders. The way the policy was designed, it also provided counties with kind of a license to experiment, which represents a great opportunity for the state to learn about the effectiveness of various kinds of strategies, programs, and interventions that can reduce recidivism. Earlier this summer, my colleagues Magnus Lofstrom, Steve Raphael, and I published an initial look into the question of whether changes in recidivism patterns of offenders released from prison were attributable to realignment. And we found that adjusting for differences in the composition of pre- and post-realignment groups, one-year recidivism rate changes were quite modest. We saw slight decreases. Let me see if I can get the pointer to work. I guess it doesn't work. Slight decreases in all arrests, which by about 2 percentage points, and slight increases in felony arrest convictions and felony convictions. And I think probably at the outset it's important to sort of differentiate what we're trying to do here today from that first piece of work on recidivism. First of all, we're following in this study just a segment of the prison population, prison release population, which is the post-release community supervision segment. And in this study, we follow them not for an entire year, but for 6 months, and we can talk about the reasons for those choices in a minute. And as a result, it's important to note in particular that the numbers that we report are not directly comparable, and I'll try and draw continuities with the substantive interpretations that we have between the two studies as we go along. Okay, so here we're specifically interested, as I said, in the post-release community supervision segment of the community. And these are offenders being released from prison for convictions of non-serious, non-violent offenses. And this excludes offenders that CDCR designates as mentally disordered or high-risk sex offenders. Those offenders, along with individuals who have serious or violent commitment offenses, once they're released from prison, are still placed under state parole supervision. And for these offenders, we're interested in really two questions. One is, can we attribute changes in recidivism patterns among these offenders to realignment? And the other is, do the approaches that counties adopted in the initial year after realignment impact their recidivism? And it makes sense to look specifically at the PRCS to answer such a question because state parolees, because they remain under state authority, are unlikely to be affected by what strategies counties adopt. Okay, so a little roadmap for what I'm going to cover in the presentation here. So first we're going to consider the question of changes in recidivism among the PRCS, and then we'll describe what we found in relation to the second question around county approaches to realignment. And then I'll spend a little bit of time at the end sort of drawing the threads together. But before I segue into that, researchers, I think we should note that researchers sort of face considerable challenges in trying to isolate the impact on recidivism of policy changes like realignment. And the reason is that one has to try and rule out the possibility that changes in recidivism are attributable to changes in the composition of the pre- and post-change groups. And we also have to try and control for other factors, maybe that some of which we can't measure directly, that are characteristics of counties that might be driving changes in recidivism patterns. And then finally, we need to determine and rule out whether or not there weren't pre-existing trends, and so the trend that we observe around the change is in fact attributable to the change and not attributable to some underlying trend. And in the report and a quite lengthy technical appendix, we describe in detail the steps we took to address those three considerations. Here we want to focus on sort of the summary implications of that. In a nutshell, after making adjustments for the factors that I just described, we find that when all arrests are considered, including arrests for supervision violations, felonies, and misdemeanors, there were really no differences between the PRCS and comparable offenders in the pre-realignment period. We do see a 4.7 percentage point increase in felony arrests and more slight increases in both measures of convictions. Again, although not directly comparable to these results parallel what we found in previous work of a slight increases in felony arrests and convictions, which we interpreted as resulting from the elimination of revocation back to state prison as a means of responding to supervision violation. This seems to have encouraged a greater use of criminal prosecution and adjudication in the post-realignment period. In the earlier report, we found modest declines in arrests when PRCS and state parolees are considered together. Here, our findings suggest that declines in those that we found in those initial analysis are likely driven by declines in arrests of state parolees. As you can see, the arrests for PRCS don't really change very much. Now, we also wanted to consider whether there were time trends that were unfolding prior to realignment that might account for the increases we see in the previous slide. And the idea of these analyses is to go back further in time and to suppose that realignment happened in the year before it did, and then ask the question, do we see over time increases? In other words, construct the analysis in exactly the same way, but in a period prior to realignment. And when we do see that in the period prior to realignment, all arrests were actually increasing fairly modestly. But interestingly, in the previous slide, that's precisely the area where we don't see changes across the realignment change. Among the other measures, we see sort of mixed. There's no change there's no evidence of a trend in convictions prior to realignment, slight increases in all convictions and slight decreases in felony arrests. And both those top three measures are, again, the measures where we found increases in all of the measures of recidivism, and thus it doesn't appear that there's any continuation of a pre-existing trend. And that sort of gives us confidence that the findings that we observe specifically around realignment, are not simply a trend that was sort of unfolding prior to realignment. Okay, so having shown that there were slight to modest increases in felony arrests and convictions, now we want to explore whether approaches that counties adopted as part of their first-year implementation of realignment account for changes in recidivism patterns of the PRCS across counties. Now, as part of realignment, the state gave counties a substantial chunk of funding and kind of a broad directive to design policies that sort of, from the county's point of view, would be most effective in managing the new offenders. In exchange for the funding and sort of the encouragement to experiment, counties were required to submit implementation plans and budgets that account for how they plan to spend the money. And these are useful for us in terms of characterizing county approaches in these early phases of realignment. And I think I want to sort of pause here and say what we're doing in this research is actually characterizing what counties said they were going to do in their plans, not characterizing essential characteristics of counties in terms of pre-existing approaches that defined how the county does business. This is really about what they said they wanted to do in the plans. We're agnostic about the other question. So from a policy standpoint, this freedom to experiment was actually quite fortunate because it means that we kind of have 58 laboratories experimenting with different approach, at least the possibility of that. In actuality, what we see, as I'll describe in more detail in the future, in a minute, is that counties tend to converge around a couple of different strategies. Okay, so in order for there to be effects of county policy approach on recidivism, there has to be some degree of variability in the change in recidivism patterns across counties. If all counties changed in pretty much the same way, then variation in the way in which counties implemented realignment couldn't possibly have any effect, right? And there appears to be quite a bit of variation. Ventura, some counties like Ventura had quite substantial increases in felony arrests. Some counties had substantial decreases. And I should say, this is obviously just a subset. We made this figure so that it could be easily read from the last row of this audience. We chose these ones to characterize the distribution. But the main point here, the takeaway, is that there's quite a bit of variation in terms of felony arrest, the change in felony arrest across realignment. And the same is true for felony conviction rates. Some counties saw increases in their conviction rates. Some counties saw decreases. Most were somewhere in the middle where they experienced slight, modest increases or decreases. So there, in addition to being variation in the change in recidivism across counties, there also has to be some variation in terms of what counties plan to do. And so this slide basically uses the aspects of the plans that talk about what counties aspired to do, what are the kinds of services and programs that they sought to implement. This is, again, a subset, but you can see that most counties in those plans indicated a desire to build or expand substance abuse and mental health programs. Some more mixed group said that they wanted to build housing programs, and a minority of counties said they wanted to implement parenting classes, restorative justice programs, and mentorship type programs. Now, again, this is just a subset. There's quite a few other programs that. So again, there's quite a bit of variation in terms of what counties said they wanted to do. There's also quite a bit of variability in what they said they wanted to spend the money on. Some plans devoted as much as 87% of their allocations towards the programs, which is the top line up here. This would be 87%. Some county plans said that they weren't going to spend any money on program. 50%, half the counties are within this box on the program things. Unfortunately, our pointer doesn't work. Between about 12 and 34%. So again, lots of range just within this particular budget item. And then you can see sort of for law enforcement, I think the one county plans devoted 23% of their funds to law enforcement, but half the county said they weren't going to put anything into law enforcement. Okay. And again, the interpretation of these others is the same. Let me just give you one more. Plans range between allocating 0 and 86% to probation, with half the counties ranging between 20 and 38%. Again, this is 28 and 30%. Half the counties are in there. But you can see the story here is very much the same as the previous slide, which is when it comes to budget allocations, there's quite a bit of variability in terms of how county plans carved up the funds. So we then took the measures that we gleaned from the plans, and the budgets. We took those measures and tried to use them to sort counties into groups. And after experimenting with 2, 3, and 4 different categories, we found that 2 groups of plans emerged most consistently and robustly. Not all of the counties actually fit perfectly into these two groups, and thus in what follows, we'll talk about just the counties' plans that fit most closely with the sort of ideal types of these groups. We'll focus on a subset, in other words. And the 2 groups are reentry-focused plans and enforcement-focused plans. And reentry-focused plans were defined by, on average, devoting quite a bit more resources to programs and services, 2 times the budget share devoted to programs and services as compared with enforcement-focused plans. Reentry-focused plans also indicated the intention to use a wider range of service options, and then enforcement-focused plans devoted more of their budgets to sheriff's, jails, and law enforcement, 3 times as much as reentry-focused plans, and indicated intention to use a narrower range of reentry services. And then we undertook analyses that were similar in terms of adjusting for differences between PRCS across counties and across groups and across realignment, and found that on average, recidivism of all types decreased more and increased less in counties adopting plans emphasizing reentry services relative to counties adopting plans emphasizing enforcement. And you can state this result the exact opposite way. Recidivism in counties with realignment plans focused on enforcement tend, on average, to see greater increases in recidivism relative to counties that adopted more reentry-focused plans. And specifically, we find the changes in recidivism in counties adopting reentry-focused plans were between 1.7 and 3.7 percentage points lower than counties that adopted enforcement and focused plans. And so, as a summary kind of bullet takeaway here, counties adopting reentry-focused plans performed somewhat better in terms of all measures of recidivism, and we would characterize these as slight to modest improvements. Now, we also considered what we did before, which is that there were unfolding pre-existing time trends that might be actually driving what we're seeing here, and in this case, we found no evidence of that on any of the measures. Okay, so having covered the two questions, we can now turn to our conclusions. So consistent with our earlier work, we don't see dramatic changes in these early months after realignment took effect when we focus specifically on the PRCS. And like the other work, we found increases in felony arrests and felony conviction among the PRCS. Like that work, we would interpret that shift as the result of the removal of the possibility of revocation to state prison, as sort of incentivizing counties to seek prosecution and conviction of individuals who previously could have been handled through the parole revocation process. And again, in the early months of realignment, these changes are relatively modest. We do see some evidence that all arrest rates were increasing prior to realignment. However, this was not true for felony arrests. All kinds of convictions are felony convictions. And as a result, we're fairly confident that the changes in those measures of recidivism that we see are, in fact, attributable to realignment. Now, and I think we have to conclude also that, as we did in the earlier work, that in this initial period after realignment, the shifting of offenders to county supervision really had not yet produced huge reductions in recidivism. So the idea that the locals do it better has not actually borne fruit just yet. Okay, so however, we did find some evidence of slight but promising improvements in recidivism among PRCS released into counties whose plans emphasize reentry services over those that emphasize enforcement. And of course, I think we have to acknowledge that these changes are slight, that this is still, again, an early look, dependent on the only available data, and that we have not conclusively identified the mechanisms by which these improvements have been made. However, it provides some evidence that county approaches matter. Plans and budget that emphasizing reentry services, is a potentially promising route, and that even the highest level of decision making, the level of plans and budget allocations, can potentially affect on-the-ground changes in recidivism. And in a context in which there's a sort of near vacuum of information about the effects of strategic approaches in counties, this research provides an initial look. Now, as we go forward, it will be critical to unpack the specific programs, interventions, and strategies that provide reductions in recidivism, and that is what we at PPIC plan to do in order to help counties and the state through this historic transition. So that's my comment. Thank you for listening. So, I'll ask Mia to come up, and we'd be happy to take questions from the audience. Yeah.
What is your definition of recidivism?
Well, so our definition, we have the multiple measures of recidivism that we used in the slides there. So arrests, felony arrests, convictions, and felony convictions are the ones that we considered here.
Yeah, you displayed a graph. You have a copy here on, it's your figure 1, page 12. It demonstrates that Ventura County was leading the pack in terms of increases in arrests for felony violations. The very next chart, which shows the counties in order of how many new convictions, shows that Ventura County had a decrease in the number of felony reconvictions.
Yeah.
How do those two comport? You have a 32% increase in felony arrests, but you have a decrease in felony convictions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you want this?
Oh, it's on that side. So there are a few instances where that actually happens, and it's possible that those counties are seeing the weight of this huge number of increases in arrests and basically deciding to have an entirely different strategy to processing them. But it's very difficult for us from data provided from CDCR to know exactly how decision making is changing in counties. So. And that will go for any specific county level question that we get here. It's not possible for us to account for an individual level county's change, but what we can speak to with this kind of data is sort of the average changes over time. And
well, if you were measuring increase in arrests as recidivism, you'd have a very substantial increase, obviously, in Ventura. And if you were measuring the reconviction rate, you would have a decrease. So kind of hard to follow trends there.
oh, do you want to try?
I think there's a couple things that can be going on. One is the relationship between the decision makers that process arrests and the decision makers that move forward with convictions. They may have different procedures in place, so you have multiple actors and you have a long process. And if actors are not on the same page, then you can see differences in different measures of recidivism. And that's part of why we think it's important to look at multiple measures to get a fuller picture of what's happening. What could also be at work, because this is just descriptive information, we haven't controlled for any difference in characteristics. You could have differences in the characteristics of individuals in Ventura versus other counties. And this is true of all the counties in the study. And it's hard to imagine a story where one would have the characteristics that would get you arrested but not convicted, but I'm sure that could be.
32% more arrests, and something happens to them after they're arrested. Apparently not conviction.
Well, we also don't know about the timing of the process in Ventura. If they're really having a long delay in getting to prosecution, then they may not be showing up yet because we don't have a very long recidivism window. So, I mean, you're very right to point out this is sort of a strange story in this county, but we haven't been able to unpack sort of what might be going on in that particular county yet.
Thank you.
I'm curious if there's some way you can tell whether there's really a change in the behavior of offenders versus the behavior of law enforcement, the district attorneys, and the courts.
I think that's really what one of the questions we're interested in looking at. Right now, we don't have the kind of data we'd need to look at that question, but we're currently in the process of collecting it.
So, and this is
Are you likely to know more about this in, say, 2-3 years?
Definitely.
So it's always, this is a kind of constant challenge in recidivism research in general, is that knowing how to parse what is attributable to changes in how offenders are monitored, how their violations are processed from behavioral changes is extremely difficult to do.
Hi, I'm wondering, with your reconviction rates, are you looking at reconvictions that led to return to jail as well as return to prison?
Yeah, we're looking at all reconvictions.
Okay.
And right now, we don't have much information about returns to jail custody because we don't have that local data. So
Okay.
we're hoping to have that in the future too. That's going to be a common refrain, I think.
All right. Okay, also I'm wondering, do you have sample sizes for each of your two groups?
Yes. Well, we have the full population that was released from CDCR.
Okay, do you know those numbers off the top of your head? I'm just wondering if they're comparable between the enforcement versus the reentry counties.
Right. I definitely see what you're saying. So is this the same number of people?
Sure, or
The
comparable anyway.
It's a good question. There's 15, the number of counties differs, but of course the size of the release cohorts differs as well. I believe we have cohort size in the technical appendix, so let me just scroll down to it.
Well, I saw cohort size, but you didn't
Yeah.
split them into, did you split them into enforcement versus?
Yeah.
You
Did
know,
you? Okay.
I don't think you have this table in the paper version, but it's in the technical appendix.
Okay.
And, you know, what's really important is making sure that you've controlled for differences in their characteristics. Numbers shouldn't have much of an effect, so let's see here. We have, in the post-realignment period, we have a smaller number of offenders in the reentry services focused group, but this is sort of the rate of recidivism, not the number of recidivism events. So that should be adjusted for. However, you might have an idea that I haven't thought of about why that might be important. Okay.
Hi, my question was related to her first question. As far as convictions, are you including revocations in that or actual new convictions?
So revocations are included in the all arrest measure because there isn't actually, well, there is a formal process to revoking someone, but we've sort of put those in with arrests because they're typically kind of an arrest and then movement to jail custody without a trial or a plea.
Okay, so they are not part of,
Yeah.
So they're
Okay.
included, but in the all arrest measure.
okay. And what about flash incarceration?
Flash incarceration is not included here. There are two reasons. One is that we don't have access to that data at the local level because you're flashed into a jail setting. And the second is that we are kind of grappling with whether to think about flash incarcerations as recidivism events or as interventions to prevent recidivism.
Yes. My question is about the reported recidivism rates in the comparisons. Am I correct in concluding that these rates are actually not observed rates in any population, but estimated rates based on the model that was applied to control for differences among the populations?
In the second phase of the study, the second component,
What's up on the chart there, for example?
these are descriptive.
Felony arrest rates, are those observed rates in
Those
any
are observed
population?
rates.
Or
Those are
are
observed.
they estimated rates, adjusted rates based on?
Those are observed rates.
Those are
These
just
are unadjusted. This is just a
descriptive.
descriptive one, yeah.
On page 17, you list the various reentry services emphasized, and one of them is income.
Yeah,
What's-
income
what's
support,
that?
well,
That's shorthand. So a number of these are shorthand, but those are programs that focus on providing income supports, either getting you enrolled in programs or providing income support in another way as you transition out of custody and hopefully into employment.
I think they want you to use the microphone so that it gets.
Thank you for sharing. Just real quickly, I noticed the somewhat rhetorical nature of your question in terms of what's going on with recidivism. But this is the second of 3 installments, is that correct?
Well, the second of several.
Okay, all
We're
right,
not
you said
committing to a
3,
number.
okay, several. Are you going to take a look at any outcomes in terms of the actual population, in terms of what happened to people and what effect that may have had on them as individuals, or are you just going to continue to look at secondary data?
Are you thinking of employment outcomes or family outcomes or what? kind of outcomes?
Taxpayers, that they're being now reinstituted into society. Now they're being taxpayers and not tax consumers.
Well, we've had some discussions about how to gather that kind of information, and it poses a lot of challenges. We do have a more intensive data collection effort that we're doing with a partnership with the Board of State and Community Corrections that will get to a deeper level of detail about what offenders are getting and how they're being processed through the system.
I was wondering if any other organizations or even CDCR itself has done any similar research projects, and if so, are their findings consistent with yours?
Sure. So this is actually discussed in the first recidivism report that we produced earlier in the summer. That what we found in that report, using a variety of other methods to sort of triangulate on the same data, we found very similar kinds of results in terms of the work that they did. They have a number of other projects that rely on, that look at recidivism that we're not utilizing their data. They're actually here in the room, so if you want to, Denise, say a few words about.
Hi, I'm Denise Allen. I'm the Chief of Research for CDCR, and so we've been partnering with both BSCC and PPIC in providing our release cohorts, so that includes arrest, convictions, and returns to state prison. So we've done a 6-month realignment report and a 1-year follow-up, and early in the new year we'll have our second year of follow-up data. So we have found that arrests are actually down slightly, very slight, about 2%. Convictions are holding fairly constant, and of course returns to custody, to state custody, are down significantly because that's the intent of realignment. So the missing link is returns to jail, so it's happening in terms of community returns. We have kept the parole and the PRCS cohort, so to speak, in a pre-post format, and we have not separated the cohorts. Our next round of research, we will be able to look at really what's happened to those released to parole versus those released to PRCS, keeping in mind that the state doesn't have access to what's happening in the local jails. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer afterwards.
Thank you.
Yes, in your table 1, you talked about the reentry focus plans versus the enforcement focus plans, and you did point out in your introduction that the reentry focus plans did have a slight favorable rating in terms of the data. Could you quantify the number of offenders that are in the reentry focus plans?
That's similar to the question that we got a second ago.
So post realignment, and there's a table in the technical appendix. If you want to look at these numbers, it's table A6, and that's available online. We have 5,756 in that post realignment cohort, and that's just a 3-month release cohort. So that's not all of the offenders that were released post realignment, but just the group that we were working with for our analysis.
And that group was in plans, reentry plans that focused specifically on what?
So that group was released to under reentry plans that focused more on reentry, and then the cohort that was released to under plans that focused more on enforcement, that was 13,322.
Yeah, you did list a number of reentry programs that counties are operating, so that's kind of broad, but I understand the data is limited.
So you said you have about 13,000 in the larger set. Could you talk a little bit about the distribution of those across the county? Because I presume that an awful lot of them are from Los Angeles. So what are you doing to control for the different baseline sizes of the populations? Because potentially that's a source of why you have such large variance in some counties.
So we have done our analysis with and without LA with a similar concern. One thing that's important to note is that our analysis is set up to control for characteristics of the counties. And so instead of comparing offenders released to enforcement focused to offenders released to reentry focused after realignment, we actually compare within those groups. So we compare offenders released to enforcement focused to those offenders released prior to realignment, right? So we're making a comparison within county group to avoid this problem. For example, one of the concerns about there being different numbers in each group, I'm not sure this completely addresses it, but we're actually comparing within group to come up with a change in recidivism for that group pre-post realignment, if that makes sense. And then what you're seeing up there is the difference between those within group changes.
Are you looking at what they've been arrested for?
We could look into some detail on that versus, so one dimension of that is it a felony or is it a misdemeanor? And so that's why we kind of broke out felony arrests and convictions, because we're often most concerned about those. You can also go deeper into the penal codes of the arrests. We haven't done that yet.
Hi. First of all, thanks for doing the analysis, and thank you very much for allowing us this chance to ask questions. I want to make sure that I'm capturing the way you framed some of the conclusions right, because it seems to me like it would also be possible to say that there were increases in recidivism for those counties that focused on enforcement services, and there were actually decreases in recidivism for those counties that focused on reentry services. Is that
as long as you add the word relative.
Yeah.
relative to those counties?
Right, so it's a relative, I know it's hard, we wanted to do this in order to control for those differences in across counties, but you're always thinking about these results as a relative difference in outcomes. And so you could say it one way or you could say it the other way, and you're drawing the same conclusion, which is that there was a clear difference between these two groups in outcomes. And you could phrase it as there was higher or greater change in recidivism, increase in recidivism in counties that were enforcement focused, or you could say that in counties that were reentry focused, we saw a lesser change in recidivism or relative declines.
So I actually tried to say it both ways, but I probably went through it too quickly.
Okay, okay.
Just to get it, yeah.
I thought from one of the charts, though, it actually looked like in the counties with the reentry
That's the way we
focus, it really was decreases in recidivism.
We had a lot of discussion
only
about how to
relative
present.
to, okay.
Yeah, I mean, what Mia said is
Not relative to their baseline.
right.
Okay. I'm not sure what I said helped, actually, as I listened to myself. But yes, you could frame it in either.
The opposite way.
It would be accurate and the numbers would be the same, but you could frame it in either
But
direction.
it is not true that one county, one side went up and one side went down. It's only one side went up and the other side went up less.
So we have sort of the descriptives in our analysis on that, and the descriptive changes are a little bit mixed. Those are also in Table A7 in the technical appendix. And for the 4 measures, there's an indication in the descriptives that the reentry-focused counties had smaller increases in recidivism before we even began to control for any other factors. But we obviously don't want to draw that from the descriptives because they could have had people with different kinds of characteristics. So those could be driving those descriptive outcomes.
I had one other sort of question about, because the process that many counties used pre and post realignment changed so much from a reliance on the technical violation process to convictions, is it fair to look at conviction rates just pre and post? Is there any way to capture sort of that other behavior in the pre-world?
I think it depends how you think about realignment as a policy change. So that was part of the policy change. And so you could think of that outcome as being part of what realignment did, but you could also deconstruct it into sort of differences in offender behavior and differences in procedural response. And we haven't been able to do that yet, but we do hope that we and others will be able to do more of that work.
Okay. Thanks.
Hi, Ryken. Hi, Mia. Thanks for the great work and the opportunity to come together and talk about this important subject today. I have two questions, or maybe a point of clarification, just to make sure I understand. You're looking at a 6-month cohort, the real PRCS releases, for example, as opposed to the comparison group. You're looking at a 6-month period of releases and then tracking them for each of them, presumably for 6 months beyond that, and then you also have an analysis where you go for a year. Is that correct?
That's correct. The only thing I would clarify is that there's no overlap.
No overlap between the
Right.
Right.
Between the two.
Release, please, before realignment. Yeah.
Got it. So I think an important point for those of us who are out there in the field and practitioners is that this study is therefore really looking at the early iteration of realignment, the first year or so, if that's fair to say. To that extent, nonetheless, really valuable work. Is there some, hopefully, interest by the PPIC to continue this analysis as we go forward in time? So I know, speaking here for Sacramento County, obviously the biggest change in California criminal justice, maybe in our state's history, certainly the version of realignment that we had here at the county level is not the same version that we have today in 2014. So hopefully there's that effort to continue with this really important work.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, that is part of the reason why we're shifting to a data collection strategy that we can generate kind of more detailed, richer data about what's happening in the counties. I'm not sure we're going to continue we've talked about it, but I'm not sure we're going to continue the focus on the level of planning and budgeting. But there's definitely the direction that we want to head is towards greater level of proximity to what offenders are actually getting, and because we think that's where the next set of lessons are likely to lie.
Great. And if I could add just one last question. I know your paper was careful to make this point. I think it's an important point to stress today that could be lost. As we look at pre and post realignment and talk about things like arrests and convictions, obviously one of the most significant changes brought by realignment is virtually eliminating the reliance on revocations to state prison. And that's a tool, obviously, when we look at conviction rates today and compare them to pre-realignment, it's absent that tool, which every DA and prosecutor would recognize they played some part in accommodating criminal prosecution, so to speak. Can you comment a little bit on that?
That's precisely the way that we've been kind of trying to provide context on that finding. And we did it in the first recidivism report, and we carried over the same argument. I don't think that finding is meaningful on its own. It has to be understood in the context of this change and the removal of a tool that existed previously. So, yeah.
Thank you. You presented just in passing, some information about the prisoners who are still being monitored by the state, being those prisoners who were in certain categories, including a mental health category. My understanding is that more than half of those in the prison system experienced mental health issues. So that's a pretty large chunk to
Well,
pull out of the
The
pool.
specific designation is mentally disordered offenders, which is a much smaller group. People who have spent time in mental health beds in CDCR or released to PRCS are included in the study. So. Any other questions? Thank you. Do we need to say anything in conclusion? Okay. Thank you.
Thanks
Please
for
help
coming.
yourself to remaining time.